Elihu, Job's fourth friend, tears into Elihu's other three friends. He says, "You insisted that all Job has to do is go to God and say, 'I'm sorry, I did something wrong. I deserved what you did to me. So now that I've apologized, you've got to turn things around and bless me again.' And tell God he had to deal with him on his own terms." And Elihu insists, "This is wrong. You three friends are wrong. Your arguments are ridiculous. You've actually condemned God by what you've said to Job." Let's open the Bible and think on these things. This is the Word of Truth Ministry video library. I am Nathan C. Johnson, Bible teacher. I greet you in the faith and fellowship of our great God and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, whose we are, whom we love, and whom we serve. Let's turn today to Job chapter 33, where we will be continuing the argument of Elihu, Job's fourth friend. Elihu, remember last time, he said that I've kept silent up till now because I'm younger than Job and his three friends, and I figured these aged people should speak first and show their wisdom. We saw by this that Job and his three friends are probably surrounded by a crowd listening in to everything they said. He says, "I waited while each one of you composed your discourse and then gave it, and listened to it for wisdom." By the way, this gives us a hint that they weren't just answering back and forth, they were composing their answer. Of course, they were in rhyme, in verse, in meter. So they were composing them and then reading their answer, and then Job would compose his answer and say it, and so forth. He says, "I waited for you to compose an answer," and then Job's final answer, "I waited for you three friends to answer him, and you had nothing. You had no wisdom to give. You had no right answer for Job, so now I'm going to speak." He spoke first to Job and said, "Job, you've argued that you are righteous and God was wrong to do this to you. Now, I'm not going to put a hand heavy on you like your friends have. I'm going to act as this mediator you asked for. And I'm going to tell you your problem is that you've acted like you're as great as God is. And I insist that God is great and mortal man is not. You've insisted on your own righteousness, but I insist that God speaks to people to show them that they need his righteousness. They need a ransom. They need a deliverance. Sometimes he brings illness on people. He brings problems so that they'll see their need for God. So that when a messenger comes to tell them about their sin and that they need his righteousness imputed to them, they need his atonement covering over their sin, they'll receive it and enter right relationship with God. And that's what you need to do, Job, he insists. Well, good words. But today, Elihu is going to tear into Job's three friends. And we'll see how he does that. Now, again, I'm reading from Bullinger's metrical translation of Job. Job 34 and verse 1. Elihu then addressed Job's friends and said, so Elihu, remember, was angry at Job for justifying himself rather than God, and angry at Job's three friends for insisting that he must have done something wrong to cause God to do this to him, and then when they couldn't find anything wrong, therefore condemning God. Well, now he's going to speak to the three friends about what they said. Verse 2, "Hear now my words, ye wise and clever men, and ye who knowledge have, give ear to me." So he calls on these wise and clever men to hear him. Now I think I might detect just a note of sarcasm here, because he's already ripped into these men for having no answer for Job. So he says, "You wise and clever men who had no answer whatever for Job's arguments. I'm going to speak to you now. You think you have so much knowledge? Well, then listen. I'm going to show you some real knowledge, unlike what you had to say." Verse 3, "For 'tis the ear that proves and trieth speech, e'en as the palate shows what food is good." So he says, listen to me, since it's the ear that tests speech and see if it's good speech, just like it's the mouth that tests food and sees if it's good food. He says, so listen to me and test my words. That's how words are tested. Verse 4, "Then let us, what is right, choose for ourselves. Let us decide among us what is good." He says, once you've heard my words and have chewed on them and listened to them, He says, then let's think about this and choose what's right and good, if my words are right and good or if yours are. Verse 5, now Job hath said, I am and have been just, but God my righteous cause hath turned away. So he says, think with me, you three friends. Let's think about Job's conclusion. Let me repeat it. His conclusion is, I am and have been just. I've never done anything wrong. I'm clean and pure. I don't deserve this, but El, the mighty God, why, he's rejected my righteous cause and has punished me even though I was righteous. He says, this is what Job said. Verse 6, shall I against my right speak what is false? Sore is my wound, though through no sin of mine. So these are Job's words. Job says, you insist that I should say that I did do something wrong to deserve this. That I should go back and on my own testimony to my clean conduct and say, no, I did something wrong. But Job says, I'm not going to do this. I have a right not to have to do that when I haven't indeed done something wrong. I'm not going to speak what's false and say that I have. So he says, I've done nothing to deserve this sore wound. I insist on it. Well, that's what Job said. So what does Elihu say to the three friends about what Job said? Verse 7, where is the worthy man who, like to Job, drinks up as water all your scornful words? So he says, where is a strong man like Job? Geber, a strong man like Job. Here is this worthy man, Job, receiving nothing but scornful words from you, his three friends. And he's drunk them all up and taken all of them. Elihu almost seems to say, I couldn't have stood these things that you've been saying to Job. In his sad condition, yet you've said such things to him? Who's like Job who could be patient with three fools like you, in other words? He doesn't call them fools, he's too respectful for that. He says, you scornful men who scorned him with your words. Verse 8, and keepeth company with those who sin, and doth associate with wicked men. So he says, yes, Job has drunk up your scornful words, and yet then Job has kept company with those who do empty deeds, wrong things, empty of any good. And he's kept company with rebellious men, Enosh, mortal men. Well, how so? How had Job hung out with those who do iniquity and rebellion? How had he done so? Verse 9, for he hath said, it profiteth not man that he should take delight in Elohim. He says, Job may have been innocent of your accusations against him, and he may have drunk up your scornful words, but by saying things like this, by saying that there's no profit to a man, a Geber, a strong man, from taking his delight in Elohim, in the creator and the judge of all the earth, he says, by saying such a thing, he has kept company with those who work iniquity and those who are rebellious, because that's what they say. They say, it does no good to serve God, so that's why I'm going to just do whatever wicked thing I want. It does no good to serve God, that's why I'm going to rebel against him. He says, Job, even though he hasn't done whatever he wants, even though he hasn't rebelled against God, he's taken up the same argument of such wicked and rebellious men by saying this. Verse 10, to this, ye wise men, list to my reply. Far be such evil from the mighty God, and far from Shaddai such iniquity. So he says, listen to my reply, you wise men, who yet somehow couldn't come up with this reply. Even though to Elihu it seems obvious. But he says, you wise men, here's my reply to what Job said. And then he says, far be it from El, the mighty God. And far be it from Shaddai, the all-bountiful and giving God, to act in such a way to not reward men for serving him. Would the all-bountiful Shaddai not reward his servants? Of course not. Far be it from him. He's always going to reward his servants. So the mighty God, who is so generous and giving, he's not going to ignore the good of his servants and not reward it. Job, this is not what you should have said. This is not what you should have said. You took the part of rebellious and wicked men in doing this. And I reject any thought that God is that way, he says. Verse 11, for sure man's work he will repay to him, and will requite according to his ways. He says, surely he will reward the works of all Adam's race. And he will give an Ish, a man, according to his ways, according to how he lived and what he did. Now we know that God's ultimate reward is not always in this life. We can serve him faithfully. Remember the story of the missionary coming back from serving for years and years on the field in poverty. And he's riding in this little cabin down in the deep dark hold of the ship because that's all he can afford. And meanwhile, up on the luxury decks, living in splendor, are these wealthy, wicked men enjoying themselves in their wickedness. And he says, God, I served you faithfully all these years as your missionary, and here I am down in this dank hold. Well, these wicked people party it up. Well, he was forgetting the life to come, wasn't he? God ultimately will reward his servants. And we shouldn't be distracted by the temporary situation of this life. Well, Elihu is certainly true. What he says is true, and yet God's judgment and repayment often come in the life to come. He's not judging and repaying in this life. But this doesn't negate the fact that he will do this in the end. And those whose short sight doesn't see beyond this life might think that there is no reward for serving God in this life, and no punishment for failing to serve him, and yet they are sadly and sorely mistaken. And anyone who thinks this is badly mistaken. He will pay back deeds in this life. He will. Verse 12, nay, surely God will not do wickedly, and Shaddai never will pervert the right. So he says, the mighty God, he will not do wickedly. He will not pervert justice. And Shaddai, the all-bountiful God, he will not fail to do what is right. He'll not pervert the right and give great rewards to the wicked and no reward to the righteous. He won't do that. That's not how the bountiful God acts. Verse 12, who ere to him did delegate the charge of earth, or trusted him with all the world? So he says, look, this earth, the Eretz, it could be the earth or the land. But look, this earth. Who is it who had ultimate authority over the earth and said, you know what, God, I'm going to delegate authority over the earth to you. It's really mine, but I'm going to delegate it to you, God. You take charge. Okay, God says, I'll take charge. Who did that? Who entrusted it to God? Well, no one, of course. His authority over the earth is inherent. And no one entrusted the rule of the earth to him. Of course, this is part of the problem. God is the one who has inherent authority over the earth, and yet what did he do? He delegated authority over this world to Adam's race. And what did we do with it? We turned away from God and followed Satan's way. So what did that result in? It resulted in the world where things did not always happen as they should. Where things are not always right and fair and just. Where there's a lot of unfairness and randomness on earth. As Solomon says, time and chance happen to us all. And the ultimate reward for all is death. There's no reward of eternal life for the righteous, or punishment for the wicked of death that doesn't fall on the righteous in this world. No. In this world, all die, the righteous and the wicked. But the problem is that authority over this earth was delegated from God, the one who ultimately had it. And not that someone else had the authority and delegated it to God and then God misused it. No, he had delegated it to us and we misused it. That's the problem. But he says, no one delegated to God authority over the earth. Verse 14, should he think only of himself and all his breath, the breath of life withdraw, what then? So he says, suppose God would only think of himself and not think of us in his control over the earth. And therefore decides, I want all this spirit back, the ruach and the neshama back, the breath that I gave. And ruach and neshama here are used together, as is often the case. So he says, if God would do that and draw back all the breath that he gave out. Verse 15, all flesh together would at once expire, and man would straight to dust return again. So he says, if God would do that, if God would pull back his spirit and pull back his breath, well, all flesh would expire. Their breath would be gone, and they'd all be dead all at once. And man, Adam's race, would straight return to dust, to the soil. Really, this is the topsoil. It's the same word as used in Genesis 2:7 when it says, God made man of the dust. That really means the topsoil of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living nephesh, a living soul. Well, but if God took back that breath of life, why, we'd go back to topsoil again. Because our lives come directly to us from God as a gift. So he says if God took back that gift, we'd all return to the soil. Verse 16, now if thou understanding hast, hear this. Give heed unto the teaching of my words. So he calls on them. Again, Job's three friends. If they have understanding, to hear him. He says, hear me if you have understanding. Listen. Verse 17, can one who hateth justice rule the world? Wilt thou condemn the just, the mighty one? So he says, think about this. Could it be that one who hates justice is ruling the world? Because you made out the only way God could be just is if calamity only comes on the wicked and there's a reason for it. And then when it turns out calamity comes on Job and he wasn't wicked and there's no reason for it, they decide, well, the ruler of the world must not be just then. Well, he says this would make no sense. If the ultimate source of everything, God, is unjust, well, then where did justice come from? See, justice is a thing that must come from the ultimate source. See, if God is unjust, then there'd have to be some source above God from which justice comes that God is ignoring. But no, God is the ultimate source. So something like justice has to come from the ultimate source. It can't be that God is unjust. No, because then God would compare to the standard of justice that must be somehow above him and compare up poorly, compare up to being unjust. And that can't be. Then God wouldn't be God. He wouldn't be the ultimate source after all. But their words implied this, that God is unjust, so somehow there must be some ultimate thing called justice that's over God, that God is failing to match up to, rather than God being the ultimate, the infinite, the ultimate standard. And he says, this can't be. It can't be that the ruler of the world isn't just. He's the source of justice. He's where justice comes from. There isn't something higher than him that's justice. Verse 18, shall one say to a king, thou worthless man, or unto nobles, ye ungodly men? Of course, you couldn't say this to a king. You couldn't even say this to the nobles of a land. And you can't say to a king, you're worthless. Now, that's Belial, the Hebrew, which means a son of worthlessness, a representative of a worthless character. You can't say that to a king. Verse 19, how much less wilt thou say it then to him, who neither doth accept the face of kings, nor doth regard the rich above the poor, for they are all the work of his own hands. So if you couldn't say to a king you're worthless and to nobles you're ungodly, well, how much less can you say it to God? God doesn't favor kings or rich men in justice over the poor and the reduced in circumstances. No, he's fair and impartial to all. He is the very source of justice. So don't say to him that you're worthless and ungodly. That can't be right. All the rich and poor are work of his own hands, so why would he favor one over the other when they're all his works? Verse 20, they in a moment die, e'en in a night. The people tremble when they pass away. The mighty fall, but by no human hands. So he says these great and high rulers die in a moment. And the people tremble to see it. Oh, this man who I thought was so great, he's just snuffed out like that? Wow, that could happen to me too, and indeed it could, and it will. Now, no human hand need be involved in their fall. Of course, so many rulers are assassinated. But a ruler who escapes assassination, does that mean he's never going to die? No. The mighty fall, even if there's no assassination. Verse 21, for on the ways of men his eyes are set, and all their footsteps he doth see and note. So he watches men, that's the Hebrew ish, He watches them and notes all that they do. That's true, he does. He sees it all. Verse 22, there is no darkness and no shade of death where workers of iniquity may hide. And this is true. There is no darkness that can hide the deeds of the wicked from him. Now they try. They do their wicked deeds at night, hoping that they'll be hidden. Of course, they're hidden from the eyes of their fellow Adam's race by doing them at night. But they can't hide them by the darkness from God. No, even death doesn't hide them or their victims, by the way, from God's eyes. God saw Abel's blood crying out to him from the ground. Even though Cain hid his body, maybe his parents never found it. But God saw it. God knew darkness can't hide evil deeds from God. Verse 23. Man doth not need repeated scrutiny when he to God for final judgment comes. So God, El, the mighty God, he doesn't have to carefully scrutinize a man, an Ish, when he comes before him in judgment. He doesn't have to say, okay, let's carefully look over all the evidence. Okay, we need a lot of witnesses. Okay, we need a lot of investigation. No, God already knows everything that person did. He doesn't have to investigate. He doesn't have to repeatedly scrutinize all the evidence. When his final judgment day for that man arrives, he already knows it all. Verse 24, he breaks the strong in ways we cannot trace, and others in their stead he setteth up. So he says we can't always see what God is doing and trace out all his works. When he brings down some powerful man and sets up others in their rulerships, we can't always see him do it. We don't always trace his hand in what's going on, but he says, I believe his hand is there. Well, maybe it was in that day. Of course, today God acts only and exclusively in grace. And bringing down some high ruler would not be gracious. So God doesn't do this today, but certainly we see God working behind the scenes in books like the book of Esther, where God brings down the mighty man Haman in a way that nobody can really see his hand working, but still his hand is there. And by the way, he set up in his place Mordecai, like he says, he sets up someone else in his place. Verse 25, to this end takes he knowledge of their works, and in a night he overthroweth them in such a way that they are all destroyed. So he says, for this purpose he's taking knowledge of their deeds, so that he can overthrow and destroy them all at once when he feels it's right to do so. Verse 26, sometimes he smites the wicked where they stand, in open sight of all men who behold. And this is true, sometimes God does this. Now there are times he doesn't. He allows the wicked to get away with it, apparently till their death. But there are even times when God can openly strike down the wicked. For example, Sodom and Gomorrah. That's an example of God's open punishment. What did he do? He rained burning sulfur on those cities and destroyed them completely. And what happened when a month or so later he came to Abimelech, the king of the Philistine nation, and told him, you're a dead man, because that woman Sarah you took is another man's wife. And Abimelech, he was shaking in his boots. Why? Because he saw what God just did to Sodom and Gomorrah. He knew that God had recently done this. And so he was terrified at God's statement to him. In the New Testament, what did God do? He struck Herod dead on the spot, struck him down for daring to take credit that belongs to God alone. And he was eaten by worms and died. But God struck him down in an open way, and God does sometimes do this. Although not always, of course. Verse 27, because they turned back from after him, nor any of his ways would they regard. So he strikes the wicked down. Why? Because they didn't follow him as they ought to have done. They didn't regard his ways, but went their own way. Verse 28, but by oppression brought the poor man's cry to him who hears the plaint of the oppressed. He says instead of following God's ways, they oppressed the poor, those reduced in means and circumstances. And he heard the cries of these poor. He heard their complaint, the complaint of these oppressed. Verse 29, when he gives quiet, who can e'er disturb? Or who can see him when he hides his face, whether it be a nation or a man? So when God gives quietness, who could disturb it and upset that quietness? And the answer is none can disturb. And we'll see this in the whole earth when God brings in his kingdom and says, peace be still to this chaotic world. And I'll tell you what, that peace will come. and none will be able to disturb God's peace in his kingdom until he decides they can do it. Now, even today, God hides his presence. He says, who can see him when he hides his face? Even today, God hides his presence, so we can't see him. In the dispensation of grace, God is acting in secret. He's acting behind the scenes. And none of us can see him acting exclusively in grace. Even though he's pouring out the riches of his grace, we can't see it because he's chosen to hide his presence. And we can't trace it out and prove it in any case. Whether it be a nation or a man, the Hebrew there for nation is goy, sometimes translated Gentile, but it does mean nation. Or whether it be a man, the word there is Adam, a member of Adam's race. Verse 30, whether because the godless may not reign, or those who of the people make a prey. Whether he acts so that the godless may not reign, may not rule. The hypocrite is the godless, the hypocrite, or a profane Adam. So that a hypocritical, profane Adam might not reign, God acts. Or those who make a prey out of innocent people, that they might not rule anymore. God may act and nobody sees him do it. Verse 31, if Job had spoken unto God and said, I have borne chastisement and never more. So he says, if Job had spoken unto God, and basically he's going to say, if he spoke to God like you three suggested. So he says, you three suggested a way that Job should speak to God. The mighty God, El. You say, Job should have said to God, well, I admit it. You have punished me, and I swear from now on, verse 32, will I transgress? That which I do not see, teach me thyself. If in the past I wrought iniquity, I will not work it more. So he says, this is what you said, Job, to say. I'll admit you've punished me. I won't transgress anymore. Show me. Teach me all the things wrong I did. All the iniquity I did in the past. Then I won't work it anymore. He says, if Job had said this to God like you suggested, verse 33, should he requite on thine own terms and say, as thou wilt choose, so be it, not as I? Say therefore now, O Job, if thou dost know. So he said, if Job said this, should God answer like you suggest on your terms? Well, okay, Job. If that's what you want, I'll do it that way. Since you say I did wrong, therefore restore me. Okay, I'll restore you on your terms. As you choose, let it be, not as I choose. I was choosing to bring all this on you, but since you said, no, God, you got to do it this way. I did wrong. You have to forgive me. I'll do it. So he says that's what you wanted to do, Job's three friends. You wanted God to respond on your terms. And your terms are, I have sinned, so I admit it, make it all better. You decided it should be that way. That's what God should do. Three friends. That's the way you think it is. Okay, Job. Job, is this how you think God should act? So he's saying your advice is worthless. God isn't going to act this way just because you say he should. Verse 34, for me would men of understanding speak. Yea, every wise man listening now will say. So he insists that every mortal man, every Enosh who understands would agree with Elihu. And he insists that every Geber, every strong man who hears would agree with him. In other words, that what Job's three friends are saying is not right. And what Job is saying is not right. So what would they say? Verse 35, Job without knowledge spoke in ignorance, and void of understanding were his words. So they would all say that if Job said such a thing, God, okay, you punish me. I give in. Teach me my iniquity. I won't do it anymore. Okay, now you have to make it all better. They would have said, Job spoke in ignorance. That wasn't right. His words were void of understanding. They would have all said this if Job had spoken to God the way these three friends told him to. Verse 36, oh, would that Job were proved unto the end, for his replies are those of evil men. So he says, I don't want Job to answer like you three friends say, but still I wish Job were examined to the last degree since what he said is what wicked men say. That is, that serving God is useless. And wicked enosh, wicked mortal men say this. So I want Job's words to be proved wrong, because I don't want the words of these wicked men who say it's fine to rebel against God because it doesn't really matter. I want those words to be proved wrong. Verse 37. Rebellion he doth add unto his sin. Defiant in our midst he claps his hands. And against God he multiplies his words. So he says Job adds rebellion to his sin by saying such things. So it's like he claps defiantly against God. He cheers what the wicked say. The wicked say, it's useless to serve God. What's the point? God doesn't reward you for it. He doesn't punish you for being wicked. So don't bother. And Job claps. Because he says, yep, that's right. I agree with that. So he says that, Job, you're adding rebellion to your sin. You multiply words against the Almighty God. You can't talk like this and be right. So Elihu in this portion tears into Job's three friends. He says, you haven't made a proper argument. You condemn God by your words. Elihu insists when God acts, he always does so to promote justice, and he always does so to frustrate the ways of the godless and tyrants. He always acts to help the poor and oppressed who don't deserve oppression. And God doesn't, in fact, work unjustly. Well, of course he's correct. God never acts against justice. He never acts to favor the wicked and to increase the oppression of the innocent. So the problem with Job and his friends is that they're assuming that what has happened was done by God, when in fact it was done by Satan. Now Elihu doesn't argue that. He doesn't know that. But he insists that Job is wrong to claim that God has done wrong. And his friends too have said the wrong thing about God. What did they say? Well, they said, you should approach God and say, I stopped sinning, so now you have to bless me. And God would have to deal with Job on Job's terms. Oh, okay. If you say that, I'll have to bless you now. Well, no, God doesn't have to act like Job and his friends think he should. He acts as he thinks he should act. He's greater than us. And so we shouldn't think that we can come to God and dictate the terms. Well, he's right. And certainly Job and his friends are wrong. And we'll see next time, Elihu will address Job a second time, and we'll see what else he has to say to Job. But if you've enjoyed this message, please press like below and comment, if you will. These things help promote our videos. So until we meet again around the pages of God's book, I bid you goodbye.